Now, I'd like to welcome Sarah Gilbert, who will be presenting today's webinar, Supporting LGBTQ Students. Sarah is the founder of Transitions Therapy, LLC, a virtual therapy practice serving trans and gender questioning teens, adults, and the people who love them throughout Connecticut. Before I give the floor over to our presenter, Neil here is going to snap a few screenshots for our social media.
All right, everyone, look at the camera and smile. And let me do one more. All right. All right, good. Thank you.
All right. Sarah, it's all yours. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And my thanks to Jen for even getting this set up. It was a real pleasure talking with her a few months ago to talk about creating this training and bringing this to you all. So I am really excited to be here. My name is Sarah Gilbert. My pronouns are she, her. So I have them listed after my name on the Zoom screen. So right off the bat, I want to share that as a tip as we're using various virtual or video platforms. One way that we can show that we are open and affirming and inclusive of the LGBTQ community is to start sharing our pronouns in all the ways that we can. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. In my private practice, I provide individual therapy as well as a support group for spouses and partners of trans individuals. And since 2018, I've also been doing lots of training. So I'm very excited about this, and I'm hoping that this training provides good value for you today. So I wanted to just share a little bit before we get started about my approach to trainings. I don't know about you all, but I know I have certainly been to plenty of trainings as a therapist where somebody's talking at me for hours and hours and questions have to be held off until the end. That is not the approach that I take because I want this to be an engaging and interactive learning experience. So as I'm going through this training today, I really encourage you to be open to sharing questions, reflections, comments. Please treat this as kind of like an open space. This is an opportunity for all of you as educators to do some learning and hopefully some unlearning today too. No questions are off topic. There's no bad or inappropriate questions. Feel free to ask whatever is relevant to you and the settings that you work in. A lot of times I have found that when people do share a question or a comment, that it ends up being something that's really helpful to everybody who's in the training. So please don't be shy. As far as what I like to do with my trainings is I invite people to interact by either unmuting yourself to ask a question or a comment, or if it feels more comfortable to you, put something in the chat. So whatever way feels more comfortable to you, I can accommodate that. We'll get started. So obviously this is just an hour and a half, so I can't possibly cover everything on this topic, but I do hope that you get some important things out of today's training. My hope is that you get a basic understanding of sexuality and gender diversity and how these elements of our identity do affect multiple aspects of students' lives. And for me, what's always important in any training I do, whether it's educators or fellow therapists or medical professionals, I always want to make sure that people are leaving my training experiences with being able to have at least one or two action steps that you can start implementing or at least start asking about and trying to get a ball rolling if you can in your settings to help put some of this knowledge to use, so that we can all work to create more inclusive and welcoming environments for LGBTQIA+ students. So with that, we'll kind of continue with the training now that I've set the frame for how I'd like to do today's training and what my hopes are as far as what you get out of it. Who else here, just a quick show of hands, who else here is a Ted Lasso fan? I know I'm not alone here. Yes, okay, big Stephanie, I see both hands up, nice. I appreciate the, and Carrie's got her hands raised, great, awesome. I figured I wasn't alone in that. So what I wanna share with you is this really, I think, important, meaningful quote from Ted Lasso to keep in mind as we go through today's training, to please approach this training and any other future learning opportunities with being curious rather than judgmental. I think that that's a really important mindset for all of us to keep in mind. Even if we are professionals who have been in this field for many, many years, we're always able to continue to learn and evolve and adapt. And so I really want to invite you to be curious today, rather than judgmental. Be aware if some things that I talk about maybe challenge some previous assumptions you had or some things you thought you knew, and sit with that discomfort and be brave to talk about it here if you feel like you can, rather than judging it, because my hope is that we're all working together to create open and affirming spaces for our students. So let's go over some basic terminology. Usually when I do these trainings, people have a pretty good understanding already of what these acronyms, what these letters in the acronyms stand for. But I do want to make sure that we all have the same basis of knowledge as we get started today. So LGBTQIA. L stands for lesbian, women who are attracted to other women. Gay stands for typically men who are attracted to other men. Women can also use this label as well. It is a common misconception that that is a label that only men can use. So LGB, bisexual, attracted to both sexes, bi being two in that part of the word there. Transgender, this is my area of specialty. So when we're talking about anybody who is transgender, we're talking about somebody whose sex that they are assigned at birth, male or female, doesn't line up with the gender that they are, their inner sense of knowing. So that's the T. Q can stand for a few different things. Q can stand for queer, which is a term that has been reclaimed by the LGBTQIA community. It also can stand for questioning, somebody who's kind of considering these elements of their identity, their gender, or their sexuality. I is one of the lesser known parts of this acronym here. I stands for intersex. So I'm not going to get into a big biology lesson here today because I'm a therapist, not a biologist. But what I will say for our basis of understanding today is that there are multiple biological determinants of sex, chromosomes, genitalia, lots of different things, right? And so most of us are raised to kind of believe that there's only two categories, male or female, when the reality is there's a broad spectrum, right? It's not a neatly two-box system. There are some people that are intersex, meaning that they have characteristics of both sexes. They don't neatly exclusively fit into just the male category in terms of biological determinants of sex or the exclusively female category. It's more common for people to perhaps be diagnosed as intersex later on in life, like that there's some other medical issue that's going on, or if somebody is at a point in life where they're trying to conceive of a child and they're having some difficulty with that process, that might be where some sort of testing determines that in fact someone is intersex. So it might be entirely possible that as you're working with children in your school system, you might not ever meet a child who's known to be intersex, but wanted to include that just the same so that we have this understanding. And the A, sometimes you'll see it listed as 1A, sometimes you'll see it listed as 2 A's. So A can stand for asexual or aromantic. ACE or ARO for short. You might be hearing people using those terms to describe these aspects of their identity. So if somebody is asexual, what that means is that they don't really experience any sort of romantic, or they don't experience any sort of sexual attraction to other people. Some people will describe it as an outright disgust at the thought of sexual attraction to someone else, whereas other people who are asexual might say, just not really my thing. I get that other people have these attractions, but that doesn't really apply to me. Whereas aromantic people do not experience a romantic connection or romantic attraction to other people. Before I go on, I just wanted to stop and check in and see if there's any questions about these terms, or if there's any other terms that people have heard that I can help clarify for today's training. All right, good. I don't seem to have lost anybody yet. This is good. All right, so I'm going to continue. So in terms of other aspects of terminology to help us understand the LGBTQIA experience, I want to also separate out what we're talking about and the differences between sex and gender, because these terms often get conflated. So when we're talking about sex in this context, we're talking about a designation that is assigned to someone at birth. So when a baby is born, a doctor does a quick physical exam, looks at genitalia and determines it's a boy or it's a girl. And in some rare cases, an intersex identity can be identified early on in life. So this label is assigned to someone based on physiological attributes. Whereas I mentioned earlier, our gender is our inner sense of self. It's our inner knowing of whether we are male, female, both, neither, maybe somewhere in between. Maybe it depends on the day. Maybe it's a fluid sense of gender. Sexual orientation and attraction. That is a label that's used to describe attraction. So it is an interpersonal label. It's an interpersonal experience, where sex and gender are a personal experience. So sexual orientation and attraction, the labels for those designate whether someone is attracted to same sex, same gender, opposite, neither, or both. Some people will describe that they have experiences to an individual regardless of their gender. So in that case, that would be where someone says that their sexuality is pansexual, for example. So now that we've got the fun vocab portion of today's training out of the way, I wanted to open this up to discussion for a little bit. So I'd love to hear some brave souls answer some of these questions. Again, you can unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Here's some questions for us to consider. First, how do you know your gender? How long have you known your gender? So, I'm curious if anybody would be willing to share, or share an answer to number 2. How do you know your sexual orientation? How long have you known your sexual orientation? So, is there anybody brave enough to share an answer to either of these first 2 questions?
Hi there. The first thing that popped into my mind was the toys that children prefer to play with that could help determine whether they feel more like a girl or a boy.
Yeah, could you say a little more about that?
I don't know. I've noticed over the past few years with, and it's a good thing that we're giving children the freedom to play with the toys that they want to play with. Whereas when I was growing up, it was like, the girls played with Barbie dolls and the boys had the cars. I don't know. It just popped into my head.
Okay, great. Awesome. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. And so for you specifically, Gina, if it's okay, I'm going to ask you, since you were brave enough to share, how do you know what your gender is?
I identify as a female because I don't know, I feel like a female, and I prefer to dress like a female.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Is it a little tough to answer?
Yeah, certainly.
Excellent.
Certainly.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for being brave and kind of grappling with that. That's exactly my point and why I bring this up in this training. Mm-hmm. So for those of us who are not transgender, for those of us who are cisgender, meaning that our sex assigned at birth aligns with how we feel about ourselves, our gender, we have probably never been asked this question before. And so when you saw Gina so bravely kind of struggling to answer this question, what you see is probably the way that any of us would answer this question. Like, I don't know, I just know, right? And I want to bring that up and have us all reflect on that if you too also find this is a tough question to answer. Because when people, whether it's children, teens, adults, are telling us the truth of who they are, they're telling us that they're trans or non-binary, almost 100% of the time, early on in this coming out process, people are asked the question, how do you know? Right? We're having people look at this question in a way that those of us as cisgender people do not get asked. And the reality is that we all have a gender. We all have some sense of gender. It's just that for those of us who are not in the LGBTQ community, we've probably not had to really think much about it. So in the chat, I see some shares. I see Carol has shared, I had an early attraction to boys, right? So early on in life. But Carol also shares, I always played with cars and army men. Okay, great. So I don't know, Carol, when you talk about playing with cars and army men, how was that something that was not expected based on your gender or your perceived gender? Just curious if you want to put that in the chat or unmute, you can feel free to answer that. That may be indicative of an answer to number 3, I'm not sure, but thinking about if anybody's ever questioned or challenged you about any aspects of your identity, whether it's your gender or your sexuality or how you're choosing to communicate those things. Anybody else want to share how you know your gender, or if anybody's ever questioned or challenged you about your gender or sexuality?
Hi, I'll go ahead.
Thanks, Julie.
Honestly, I think this is the first time I've ever really thought about it. And
Great.
I can't really say I can come up with an answer about how I know my gender. I feel like the second question is easier. How you know your sexual orientation, I guess it's just basically who I'm attracted to in general. I've never like seen a woman before and been like, hey, yeah, I could get with that. Like that's just not something I thought of, but like, I don't know, your gender, I've really been thinking since you asked the question, and I don't know, I feel like that's just what I was assigned, and that's the stuff I was given, and those are the things
Yep.
I did when I was little. And I wonder if I would feel differently if I was born 10 years ago as opposed to 50 years ago. I don't know. But I feel comfortable with who I am, and I don't feel like I was deprived in any way or anything or confused. So I don't know.
Awesome.
Tricky question.
Good. I'm glad it's a tricky question. Remember, like I said earlier, my hope is that you are all open to learning and unlearning. So I really, really appreciate those of you who've been brave enough to kind of share how tricky it is to answer these questions. There's a very intentional reason why I put this in this training. When I'm training my colleagues in my Trans 101 training, I have them complete a gender questionnaire. And so this is just like a little snippet of that to get us thinking, what is it like? How do I know these aspects of myself? How do I reflect on that? And so Carol came back to clarify, girls were not supposed to play with boy toys. Yeah, so for you, Carol, it sounds like at some point in your childhood, you defied gender norms, right? And it is tricky, Chelsea, so thank you for speaking to that. And so I'm curious, and somebody can answer or we can just kind of reflect on that. The last point I want to make here is question number 4, thinking about your own personal experience. Has anyone or anything been able to permanently influence these aspects of your identity? So I'm not talking about, oh, I know this about myself and I know it'll cause me to be bullied or looked at weird, so I'll just kind of hide this part of my identity. I'm talking about a permanent change in your gender or sexuality. Was anybody here able to answer yes to that question? Probably not, is my guess, but I'm open to hearing if somebody's going to answer yes to that. Usually the answer to this one is no, right? And so I really want to give space to thinking about this as we continue today's conversation specifically about LGBTQ kids, because there's a lot of perception out there right now that there are things that are permanently influencing children's gender or sexuality. And so in order to think about that, I want us to just reflect on our own experiences and whether or not anybody or anything in our lives has ever caused changes in these aspects of our own identity. And if not, then maybe we need to look at how we are responding to youth a little differently. Somebody have a question or a comment?
I think I wasn't exactly sure what you were
Sure.
asking for, but I think if I give my example, it might help.
Sure.
So I didn't realize until 4 years ago that I was able to love without regard to gender. So definitely, and it didn't happen until I met someone that I had deep feelings for. I did not know I was capable of that.
Yeah.
So
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gina.
You're
That
welcome.
is, it's great when people are brave enough to kind of share their own examples. I think that's really important for us to learn from other people, you know, within our communities as well too. Oftentimes what happens is that with the advent of social media and the internet, it's not that trans or LGBTQ kids in general are coming out of nowhere. It's that, just like Gina has shared, a lot of people are having an awareness at an earlier age that there are these possibilities, that there's words, there's language for these identities. There are other people who feel and do similar things. And so it allows people at an earlier age to articulate their experience rather than hiding it in shame. So, you know, I already kind of clarified the first point that for those of us who are not in the LGBTQ community, these questions are probably really uncomfortable. We've probably never really had to face them before, or even just really think about it. And so that's okay. I don't want you to beat yourself up for that if these are tough questions or feel shame or guilt about it. It's just an experiential exercise to get you thinking a little bit differently. The reality is that we all have core elements of our identity, gender presentation, sex assigned at birth, and sexual orientation. That's a framework that has been put out in this book called Transgender Emergence by Arlene Isarlev. And so for those of us who have these elements of our identity that go along with social norms, we don't really have to think about it much, right? We all have a gender, we all have a way that we communicate that gender to the outside world, such as through clothing, hairstyle, accessories, right? That's gender presentation. We all have a sex assigned at birth. And for those who are in the trans or non-binary community or gender questioning, they do not feel a resonance with that label that was assigned to them at birth. So I don't know if anybody here has heard these terms, but I wanted to kind of share for us to have language of understanding what is in our society that's making it maybe difficult, perhaps more difficult for LGBTQ individuals to share their truth with us, is that our society is cisnormative and heteronormative. So what those big words mean is that it is considered norm in our society. It's considered normal to be cisgender and straight or heterosexual, right? We assume that everybody we meet is cisgender or heterosexual unless they tell us otherwise. That's why people come out, right? That's why we have this whole phenomenon of people coming out, because we're assuming that they are in the norm unless they tell us who they really are. And so we want to just start thinking about this a little differently and kind of how that aspect of society makes it difficult for people to tell us the truth of who they are when they're clearly experiencing identities that there's nothing inherently wrong with, but they don't meet what society is expecting of them. When we expose students to any sort of awareness, openness, information about diverse identities along the lines of gender or sexuality or family compositions, what we're doing is enhancing their social emotional learning, as well as the education that they're already getting in our school system. So we're also enhancing empathy and compassion for differences. So this is a concern that I hear sometimes when I am doing trainings for educators, which I've been doing more recently. And maybe you yourself have said these things, or maybe you've heard someone else say them. These kids that I work with, they're way too young for us to be talking in any way about gender and sexuality. This is not appropriate. This is a concern that continues today. The reality, however, is that kids are becoming aware of their own gender and their attraction, their sexuality, their feelings for other people far earlier than we believe. And through interactions with friends, family, the media in any way, TV, internet, social media, they're already getting messages about gender and sexuality, even if it's not overt, right? Even if it's not a clearly inappropriate way. People are seeing images of what families look like. People are seeing through how other students react to them, what's acceptable or what's not in terms of how we express gender, how we express our personal interests. So the reality that I think is important for us to sit with is that kids are not too young for us to be addressing the diversity that exists in this world, because they're already getting messages from a very early age of what society expects of them, and what normal looks like. So I talked about how society is cisnormative and heteronormative, right? So even from very early ages, youth who don't conform to society's norms of behaving in a way or dressing in a way that conveys heterosexual attraction or gender norms, right? Acting and behaving in a way that is what we think your gender is, they face persistent discrimination, invasive inquiry, weird looks, disrespect, bias. Even before youth have the language to claim identity themselves, to say, I'm gay, I'm bisexual, I'm transgender. It's very often happening that kids are being bullied, they're being shamed or othered by their peers because they're not conforming in some way. I don't know if anybody else here has read the book Unprotected by Billy Porter. It's a really powerful memoir. And early on in his book, he describes the experience of being a very young child, I think like 5 or 6, in school. And he talks about being physically beaten and verbally harassed with derogatory terms that I will not repeat, but slurs, right? Gay slurs. And he describes, like, I don't even know what I'm doing that is getting these kids' attention, but they are pegging me with these awful words. I don't even know what this F word means. I know it's bad. Because at that point early on in his life, people were picking up on the fact that he was not behaving in gender norm ways that we would expect a boy to be exhibiting, right? And so now he's a very out and proud gay man, right? And so now he knows this about himself in his adulthood. But even early on in his life, other people were picking up on nuances in his behavior and his presentation that cause him to be othered by other kids. So that's why it's really important that we are starting these conversations early on in children's lives. So, just being sensitive to at the early stages of identity development. Young people are very, very vulnerable to negative experiences, and we want to be on the lookout for that. And we want to be prepared for handling that as educational professionals. So, just think for a quick moment within the school settings that you work in, how many hours a day and how many hours a week or a month do your students spend in your school settings? Probably quite a bit, right? For most youth, school is the place that they spend the most time, second to the time that they spend at home. And so the reason why I'm so excited to be doing this training for you all today is that in school settings, we have an incredible opportunity to create a safe space for all of our students, all ages, all backgrounds, all grades. We have an opportunity to make a really meaningful impact on young people's lives because we get so much time with them. So the need is really tremendous to create inclusive, affirming learning environments.
Is there any questions about anything that I've brought up so far? Any comments or any questions? No? Okay. Okay, Chelsea says, interested in checking out the Billy Porter book. It is phenomenal. If you're a Billy Porter fan, you will read that book and it is just like he's talking. It's really great. Fantastic book. Highly recommend it. There's a lot of lessons about inclusivity and love and respect for people. So highly recommend it. So now we're going to spend about the next 5 minutes watching a brief video, hearing one student's experience in her school system. In my trainings, I want to do the most that I can to center the voices and experiences of the people who are in the communities that I'm training about. And so that's why I selected this video to share with you today. So as you watch this video, think about her story and what you're hearing, because we'll spend a few minutes discussing this once it's over.
I'm Arwen Hallorain. I'm from Austin, Texas, and I'm 13 and in the 7th grade. Earlier this year, we had a substitute in Spanish class, and I'd finished the assignment, so she asked me to write a story in Spanish. So I did, and I wrote about a girl who got married to another girl. I showed it to her, and she read it, and she goes, okay, so could you maybe write a different story? I was a little confused and I didn't really know what to do with that. So I wrote another story like she asked. But that was just sort of, it made me think, like, what was wrong with that? I realized that some of the people at my school might not be as accepting as they showed and said they were. In one of my classes, we had an assignment to write an autobiography about ourselves. And so my mom is gay and married to another woman. And so I included that, but I didn't know whether to include my sexuality and my identity, because that is part of my autobiography, but I was a little nervous because we would have to present these to the class, and I didn't know how my class would react. I'd come out to a few of my friends, and I'd just come out as bi because I didn't really know what else, because I knew that that was a label that most of them would know and understand, and I didn't really want to have to explain. But even just with bi, I did have to explain to some people. And that made me even a little more nervous. Some of my other classmates in their reports had gone through some pretty hard stuff and as they were kids. It was a totally different topic, but they were still able to stand up there and tell their stories. And I saw that that really helped the class. And so I thought that I realized that my story could help too. And telling my real story could help. And that I could do that. And I decided this while sitting at my desk preparing for my presentation. So I walked up to the front of the class to present my report, and I was terrified. My hands were shaking. I was so nervous. But I decided to do it, and I was gonna go through with this. So I talked about me as a baby and, that kind of stuff. And then talked about my mom and getting married to this other woman and my feelings about that. And then I started talking about last year and when I realized that I was actually part of this LGBT plus community that I'd heard about and how weird that was for me. And just the blank stares I got back from my classmates. The classmates that I'd come out to, because I've been out to a few before this, but only like 3 or something, they were like, oh my God, she's like saying this, like what? And the other classmates, some of them were like, oh, okay. And some of them I just noticed were like, what is happening? Like, what is she saying? What? And my teacher, so I finished talking, and she just like stared at me, and then she was like, okay, is there anyone else that wants to present? And after everyone else, she'd been like, oh, good job, like that was a great report. And then for me, she was just like, okay, next. And so I kind of got the feeling that my teacher was sort of, didn't really know what to do with me anymore. And afterwards, when I was on my way to my next class, like one of my best friends came out to me and she was like, I'm gonna give you a hug. That was really brave of you, good job. But also other people came out to me and were like, what? So what's happening with you? And I was like, so I'm bi. And they were like, what is that? And I was a little like, okay. I think that it was probably and is going to be beneficial for my class to have heard that story, my story, and know that even among us, like we're a pretty small group, but still, I'm pretty sure that later in life or maybe even next week, another one of my classmates is going to realize that they're also not straight or cis or whatever. And so I hope that this story and me being brave enough to do that will help them. But I also think it's really helped me to realize that I can tell them who I am and be who I am. I think it's been really good for me to actually stand up there in front of the class and say, I am who I am, and, I make no apologies. This is who I am. If you don't understand it, I'm happy to help you understand that, but I'm not going to change, and this is me. And telling my real story could help, and that I could do that. So that's what really made me decide to stand up there and say that.
Okay, so I would love to start a discussion. What stands out to you from that video that you just saw?
Well, I think that, watching that and taking some lessons from my kids, that it's like, as a cisgender person, like we just never had to do that. Like I don't have to stand up in front of people and tell them who I am in that way, because it's just assumed. And so then it feels, there's a little bit of guilt, but it feels very unfair that, like when my oldest said to me, how they were feeling. And I asked, like, okay, do you want me to tell people? And she's like, well, did you have to tell people when you were straight? I was like, right. So it's like, why does it have to be an announcement? But it's
Right.
this society that we're in.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, it's really interesting. And so, what you bring up, I want to reiterate that this isn't meant for anybody to feel guilty or ashamed. It's about just awareness of privilege that those of us who are cisgender and straight or heterosexual have. And with that privilege, we can abuse it and we can treat people in a horrible way. Or we can recognize the privilege that we have that's just inherent in these aspects of our identity, and use that to create spaces that are affirming and open for other people of different identities. It's about just kind of saying, okay, I do recognize that I didn't have to come out to anybody, or I do recognize that I don't feel unsafe walking out in public holding hands with my significant other, right? I do feel a sense of security because I am what society considers normal. And so what can I do to try to reach out and create important learning experiences and safe educational settings for students that I'm working with or people that I know in my personal life? Yeah, so thanks for sharing. So some other reflections. Gina shared what an open, authentic, articulate young person. Yeah, 7th grader. I was definitely not that articulate in 7th grade. No way. Amazing, Carol says. Chelsea says super powerful. And also echoes the sentiment of Chelsea has not ever needed to come out. And who knows, Gina, maybe someday people might have to come out as straight. Who knows, right? Wouldn't that be interesting if we did that? If we had the opportunity to be like, hi, my name is so-and-so, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm straight. It'd be interesting to see how people react. Anybody else want to share what stood out to you from that video? What did you notice, or what are you thinking about?
I think she was super brave, and I'm amazed that anybody at that age can be that brave and that self-assured. She's blessed that she can have that core inside of herself. But I'm going to turn off my video. I just wanted you to know I'm here and I'm listening, but I'm cooking dinner.
That's okay. Awesome. Thanks for contributing, Kathy. That's great. Awesome.
I think the adult response stuck out to me. It didn't,
Yes.
She didn't say that was bad, but she just clearly made it acknowledge that it was not the same as what everybody else was doing and made her feel not great.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura, for bringing that up. I had that as a note in case nobody brought it up, right? That it was, we probably all here in today's training know enough to know that it is harmful. It is not good to say something overtly homophobic, transphobic, awful in any way to students, right? And so we know that, and that's great. But what we also need to be mindful of is what you were just referring to in that video, the discomfort that the teacher clearly had in talking about, whether it's fictional or real, the idea of a same-sex couple. Like, it was so obvious from the one teacher's like, hey, can you write a different story? Or the other teacher who clearly just didn't want to talk about it when she shared her autobiography. So even things like that do not go unnoticed by our youth, and we need to be mindful of that people can pick up on. Even if I'm not saying anything overtly terrible, my discomfort communicates something, right? And so the teacher asking her to write a different story, I think, and I know she didn't overtly say this in the video, but my takeaway was that the teacher asking her to write a different story communicated to her that there's something wrong about that. There's something shameful in that, right? And it even seemed a little confusing, like, okay, well, I guess there's something wrong with the story. Like, I was told to change it. Whereas she probably thought the story was just fine, right? The student didn't see anything wrong with that. Okay, anything else anybody wants to share? I just want to make sure everybody had a chance to share and I wasn't cutting anybody off.
I was thinking about how, like, we're all surprised that she had such confidence, and I'm an assumption or whatever that I'm making, but she grew up with two gay women in the house, and that's completely normal. So she grew up from a young age seeing that as a normal thing. So to her, it wasn't an issue, and she didn't see it that way. And maybe that was part of what instilled that confidence in her, like, hey, this is just a normal thing. And I think that's important because a lot of our students, especially in the area that we live in, that's not an openly, not that we live in, that where we teach, in a lot of areas of Hartford, that's not an openly acceptable thing or a normal thing at that. And so it really depends on us to try to be that, I mean, I'm not a gay woman, so I can't be that role model to her, to our kids, but we can do the things to make it normal. Like, it is a normal thing, and talk about it as a normal thing and not be uncomfortable. And I don't know, does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. I think what we're speaking to is like how important it is to just normalize things for kids, right? Not making it weird. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing, Julie. That, I appreciate that feedback and kind of reflecting. And part of the training, what I hope is that as we're talking about these things and as you're learning about different things I'm talking about tonight, that you're starting to think about how this applies to your professional life and personal life, right? Like, it may be helping open the door for you to think about how you interact with people differently outside of work too. And that's also very valuable, right? So there's a lot in that video, and that's why I wanted to share it. I was hoping that would generate some good conversation, that students pick up on a lot of different ways that we communicate with them, and the ways we communicate really has different effects on our students and what their experiences are in school settings. So what I wanted to share with you is just some statistics from the most recent Glsen School Climate Survey. If any of you have not heard of this before, the Glsen School Climate Survey comes out every other year, and it gives us really valuable data of the experiences of LGBTQ youth in educational settings. So in 2019, a very sizable population here, close to 17,000 respondents. So middle and high school students. So I think that these students might be a little bit older than the ones that you were working with in your settings. But regardless, I do think this information is helpful to shed some light for us on what students are experiencing. And perhaps there are some similar things that you all are already seeing in your school settings. So the 2019 survey, what that shows us is that over half of the respondents reported hearing homophobic remarks from their teachers or other school staff. That's why I'm so passionate about providing trainings like these, and why I'm happy to be here today, because I really want to help really want to help see that percentage number go down quite a bit. And a higher percentage of students reported hearing negative remarks about gender expression from teachers or other staff. So it could be administrative staff, any number of things. So Carol says, disgusting. How could this be? I agree with you. This is really, this is not great. We need to do better. This is a national survey. So, for those of us who maybe in our own district, our own towns have a pretty progressive setting, that's awesome. And so that might be especially confusing to you, but I do want to share, this is kind of a national survey. So as I think we all know, some states, some areas are a little more open and affirming than others. So this is kind of like the average of a national, and we need to do better, right? When so many students are reporting hearing negative remarks about gender expression from staff, not peers, how do you think that makes them feel when they're at school? Do they feel safe where they are? Do they feel open to learning? Are they able to concentrate? No, probably not, right? So we know that we have to be intentional. We have to be proactive in creating more affirming, safe, and inclusive spaces, right? And the other thing that I want to share for you, as far as this last statistic on this slide, is that over half of students in this survey who were harassed or assaulted in school did not report the incident to school staff, most commonly because they doubted that anything would happen, right? So that's something to be mindful of too, of how we respond to our students when they bring something to our attention, how students see us reacting or not reacting when something is happening to another student. Provides a lot of information to them about, is it worth my time to let this teacher, this para, this office staff know if I am also experiencing something really terrible at school? So that's something to think about too, is that students are getting in a lot of information all the time. They're observing how the adults in their schools are responding when things are going badly. So yes, it's 2021, almost 2022. Some of you might be thinking, well, times have changed. We're more open and inclusive to diversity. Like, here in Connecticut, it's not all that bad. So really, what's the point of learning this? How bad can it be? Do we need to keep doing trainings like this? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, you saw from some pretty alarming statistics from the Glsen School Climate Survey 2 years ago. More recently, this came out in the media. High school students in Illinois passed around this survey, which asked students to indicate whether, yes, I want queers to go in the bathroom, or no, I don't want queer kids to go in the bathroom with us normal people. I did not make this up. This is something that was published in the news. This was released, it was posted online on October 22nd. So just a little over a month ago, about a month and a half ago. So this is why we need to be vigilant, why we need to keep doing everything we can to treat our LGBTQ students better. So this was something that was put out there by high school students. Eventually they were caught and there was some consequences for it. But the fact is, plenty of students at the school saw this survey going out before anything was done about it. This is really indicative of a recent resurgence in very open hostility towards the LGBTQ community, and it starts in schools. It's not just adults who are doing and saying these things that are very terrible. So again, think about how much time our students are spending in schools and what impact that has. And especially since COVID has hit and extracurricular activities have been restricted, the experiences that LGBTQ youth are having in our school systems have continued to have an even more of an important impact. Unfortunately, only 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth found their home to be affirming. This is results from the Trevor Project national survey that just came out earlier this year. So pretty recent statistics there. Whereas LGBTQ youth who had access to spaces that affirmed them in terms of their sexual orientation and gender identity reported lower rates of attempting suicide than those who did not. So if these LGBTQ youth aren't getting affirmed and supported at home, if they can at least access that and get that validation and that acceptance and respect at school, where they're spending a lot of time, we can be really participating in an experience that drastically improves their quality of life, that improves their mental health, that makes them much less likely to attempt suicide or any self-harm. So the emerging research is really clear how important it is for us to do everything we can to create open and affirming spaces. Any questions or any comments before I continue? I just wanted to check in and see if anybody had any reactions to anything or any questions. Okay. So specifically, I also wanted to include in this training a little information specific to trans, gender questioning, and gender nonconforming students, because there are some considerations, some myths that are pretty pervasive, some specific experiences that I want to help you understand better as you are supporting trans, gender questioning, or gender creative children in your educational settings. So a little bit more terminology. In terms of gender, when we're talking about, yeah, so Julie, is this a training we can get on school site during a PD? I would definitely be happy to bring that to your school. I have done that already in Wethersfield at one school, and I might be doing that at another one soon. I would definitely be happy to bring that virtually or in person. Definitely. I will put my email in the chat. You can feel free to email me, or anybody obviously can, to reach out to try to set that up, or if you want to connect me to anybody in your administration, I'd be happy to do that. Also, you will be you'll be sent an email after today's training. You'll be given access to these slides that will be available for download between now and Friday at 5. So either way, you'll be able to get the content from today's training. And then also, I'd be happy to bring this to any school. Okay, so gender expression. When we're talking about gender expression or gender presentation, we're talking again about how somebody communicates their gender identity to the outside world. So that can be through clothing, accessories, body language, mannerisms. And that is something that we can do at any point. And, you know, there's no real permanent changes when we're talking about youth here. Social transition is the process that may be initiated by a child who is identified as transgender or non-binary. Social transition it's a term that describes a number of steps that someone may take to affirm their gender identity that are non-permanent in nature. So social transition can look like somebody deciding to wear different clothing that feels more comfortable to them. It can look like someone growing out their hair or cutting their hair. Social transition can also include being referred to with a different name or different pronouns. These are all non-permanent changes. And so typically when somebody is exploring transition, this is kind of where people start, because this is something that there's no permanent changes. So if someone decides, you know what, this no longer feels right for me, they can go back to, you know, how they were presenting before. So again, just kind of reiterating, kids learn from a really early age, from feedback from their family, from friends, what behaviors, what interests are okay, and what behaviors or interests or mannerisms are cause for ridicule. So gender norms do get reinforced really early on, right? Probably earlier on than many of us might believe, right? Through statements that teachers make at school about, like, oh, well, you can't play with that toy, that's for girls, or you know, boys shouldn't wear pink, things like that. So from a very early on, kids are being very gendered, right? And so that's helpful for us to know in terms of how we're helping to shape their gender identity development and how we can work to better support that. So with that in mind, I do want to point out that not all kids who engage in any sort of gender variant or gender creative behavior do grow up to be transgender. That's a very common myth. That If I allow my little boy to play with Barbie dolls, that means he's going to grow up to be gay or he's going to grow up to be trans. That's not true. It's entirely normal and developmentally appropriate for kids to engage in gender creative play. So we need to be really cautious about jumping to any conclusions about our students. I have a very good friend who has a son who is, at the time he was in first grade, and her spouse was very concerned that he wanted to wear nail polish. And so my friend, knowing what I do for work, reached out to me and was like, I'm not worried about this, but my husband's freaking out. What do I do? What do I tell him? What does this mean? He's totally freaking out that our kid's trans now. I don't know how to handle it. And I was like, well, what this means about your son is that your son likes to wear nail polish. That's really all it means. This means absolutely nothing about your son's gender, because your son has not told us anything else about his gender. He is a boy who likes to wear nail polish, and there's nothing damaging about that. That's something that brings him joy. Let him wear nail polish. Now, part of what may be important as educators, as parents, as family members, is helping give our children resources and supports in handling if other peers are saying unkind things. But the act of wearing nail polish as a boy is not inherently bad or wrong. So we want to just be kind of intentionally being open in this awareness and realizing that this is kind of part of what makes children happy, what they explore. What we do want to be mindful of is if we are working with children who are really insistent, persistent, and consistent in telling us that their gender is not what everybody thinks it is, that's where we want to start considering the possibility that a child is transgender or non-binary, when there's this consistent assertion that no, like this isn't who I am, you keep calling me the wrong name, this doesn't feel good, I'm really upset. If children are presenting with really obvious signs of distress, like a lot of tantrums, behavior issues at school, being depressed, being withdrawn, not doing as well in school as they previously were, that's when we all kind of want to look at the possibility of a trans identity versus just a child going through play. Let me know if there's any questions about that or any comments as I continue. My hope, again, is to just kind of help provide some information to dispel some myths that I hear pretty commonly about gender creative children. So, not to get too heavy into research, but I do want to share this. There is this 1966 piece of research, so not new, it's been around for quite a bit, by Kohlberg, that shows us, that demonstrates that children are aware of their gender way earlier than most of us think they are. Now, for those of you who are early childhood educators, you may already be aware of this, which is great. I know a lot of my colleagues in the mental health field are shocked to find this out. So I always find it helpful to point out that both Kohlberg and the American Academy of Pediatrics substantiate that children have a pretty stable sense of gender by the age of 4. So pretty early on in life. And around the same time, maybe by age 5, perhaps 6, children become acutely aware of gender normative behavior. Kids become aware of things that they can say or do that will cause them to be made fun of at school or be laughed at, right? I have a daughter who's almost 7, and starting around that age, probably like 5, halfway through kindergarten, she started saying things like, well, if I do this, people are going to laugh at me, right? And so despite whatever educational settings kids are in, they're already starting to get this sort of peer feedback about what's okay and what's not okay. So what often happens is that children may have an awareness that their gender identity is probably not what people think it is, but similarly, or at the same time, they may also hold the awareness that who I really am on the inside does not make other people happy, or it causes me to get made fun of at school, or it causes my parents or caregivers to yell at me. So they may be already in the process of pretty early on kind of restricting their expression of their gender, right? If kids try to say, for example, I really, we're going shopping for clothes, I really want that pink sparkly dress, that's so cute. And the mom's like, you can't wear that, you're a boy. pretty quickly that kid's going to pick up on, okay, it's not safe for me to keep saying this to mom. She keeps getting mad every time I mention it. So I'm just not going to ask for that pretty dress anymore. Yeah. So Rosa shares like the beginning of the video. Yeah. Don't be judgmental. Yeah, absolutely. I wish all of us could take that stance. And ultimately, I wish I didn't have to do these trainings anymore, because we would be at a place of just accepting people for who they are and just allowing them to be. So what I really want to reiterate, the last point here, is that there is often pushback from parents, family, the community, especially if somebody's very connected to a particular religious community, that if schools are open and affirming and we talk about LGBTQ people, we are making kids trans. If I had $1 for every time I heard a parent say this, that schools or social media was making their kids trans, I'd have my student loans paid off by now, probably. This is simply not true. Somebody's gender cannot be influenced and cannot be permanently altered by peers, by their upbringing, by the internet, etc. Again, they may have language for experiences that they didn't have before, but being around other trans people, talking about trans people, talking about the LGBT community at large, does not make kids part of the community. So we want to just really kind of keep that in our minds and be aware, again, like thinking back to those questions you reflected on at the beginning of today's training. Has anybody ever permanently altered your gender or sexuality? And if the answer is no, then that also stands to reason that it applies to youth as well. The authentic expression of somebody's gender, however, very much can and often is influenced by peers, family members, school settings, religious settings, where it can be, the message can be communicated very clearly that what you want to do and how you want to present is not welcome here. So that's what we really want to keep in mind, especially with kids. So why is all of this important, right? What are the impacts on students when our school isn't a safe space for LGBTQ plus youth? What are the impacts on students when they have affirming, inclusive school environments? Research shows us that school environments have a significant social, emotional, and mental impacts on LGBTQ students. There's research through Glsen, as I mentioned earlier. The Trevor Project has the LGBTQ Youth Survey. I don't know if that's published annually or every other year as well, but those are just two very large recurring studies that talk to us about the experiences of LGBTQ youth. So if we think about that, we want to keep in mind that education is just one part. You know, the actual content, the learning, is obviously a very important part of students' experience at our school settings. It's also a very rich environment where they can develop their sense of selves as they go through school. So a little more information about when LGBTQ students don't feel safe at school. The Glsen School Climate Survey shows us that students were nearly 3 times as likely to miss school in the past month. So obviously when students are missing school, their academic performance is negatively impacted. If they're not in school, they're not learning as much, they're not participating, they're not probably consistent with homework. So it stands to reason that those two things are related, attendance and academic performance. When students don't feel safe in their school settings, they have a lower sense of self-esteem and connection to sense of school belonging, connection to school community. So for the last point, this probably doesn't apply to those of us who are working in very young settings. I don't know if anybody here is working at the high school age, but I did want to point this out because this speaks to kind of the long-term effects when students are not affirmed in their schools. So of the students who considered dropping out of high school, a little over 30% said they indicated that it was related to the hostile climate created by gendered school policies and practices. So that had a direct connection to a student feeling like they might not want to continue there and get their high school degree. And we know that when students don't complete their high school education, their options for gainful employment as an adult are much more limited. So looking at the other side, when schools are resourced to support LGBTQ youth, it's a very different set of results. When we get it right, we make a huge, huge impact for LGBTQ students. Students who had many supportive school staff miss school less often, were 30% less likely to feel unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. And when they're less likely to miss school, they have higher GPAs, right? Their academic performance improves. When students are at schools that have comprehensive anti-bullying policies, they heard significantly less homophobic or transphobic language at their schools. They experienced less victimization and were much more likely to report any incidents of victimization. So we have to remember that when we're creating open, affirming spaces for our students of diverse identities, we can create a safe haven for them that has numerous benefits. So obviously, all of you in educational settings are helping to make a positive impact when you are working in schools and advocate for changes to help make your school environments more open and affirming to LGBTQ youth. Let me know if there's any questions or comments as I continue through these slides. Okay, so we've heard some statistics, we saw the video, we've learned some things so far. So I want to go into the final portion of this training of, okay, well, what do we do about this? How do we best support our students? What are some practical things to consider about? So as I go through these following slides, I invite you to share what you've already done or what is happening at your school setting, or any ideas that you have to add to this conversation, maybe some things that you will start thinking about as a result. So I see somebody raise their hand. I don't know. Can you unmute yourself to share a question or?
Yeah, I have a question.
Great.
So there's, if students come up to you and come out to you and they tell you this, my biggest thing is how to support them with their parents who might not accept that. Like, for example, I had a student who, probably was gay, and, shared a lot of things that he liked and identified with. And the mother, said to me, she kind of noticed it as well, but was fearful because the dad was not accepting of such things. So how, do you broach this topic with parents without, hurting the child in the process and getting them so that their parents will, react in a negative way towards them?
That's a really big question. What is your role at the school?
I'm a teacher.
Teacher, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it is very challenging, to be quite frank. It is tough because we are trusted with, especially if a student is clearly coming out to us, we are trusted with some very personal information that they may not feel comfortable sharing with the people that they live with.
Right.
It's great that the student trusts us, but it also puts us in a really difficult position. So depending on our role and depending on how much access we have to the parents, it can be really helpful to start to at least highlight how well the student is doing at school. If there's certain circumstances, like, if we're noticing positive changes in their academic performance or their engagement with peers in after-school activities or things like that, wanting to try to highlight that first, like how well the student is doing in school, especially if there's been a change. I know in some cases where once a student comes out and they're able to kind of express that and be affirmed in that at school setting, we see some positive changes. So can we communicate that to the parent and then see how they respond to that, to see if they've noticed that? It's also really important, if possible, to get the parents connected to either some sort of their own support groups. Like PFLAG has really great supports for parents and families if they're open to it. And it also depends on if the student wants to be out to both parents. I don't know, in this particular situation, the student wasn't out to dad, or was? I don't remember.
No, the mom expressed to me that she, you know, has seen situations where he has displayed behaviors that could indicate that he's gay. And she was worried that dad would respond negatively. And I think the kid knew it too. And he would, you know, he would act out in other ways in class. And so it's just, it's so hard to like, you want to say to them, I'm here for you if you need to talk, but then you have that balance with parents, like, well, why are you talking to my child like that about that topic? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, you want to be that trusted adult, but then you worry about crossing that line with, well, that's not your role.
Yeah, at your school, do you have a social worker or a psychologist or
Yes.
guidance counselor that
Yeah.
the youth could get connected to?
Yes, and I would totally refer the situation to the social worker because they're, you know, better trained in this situation. But, you know, I want to be that person for my student that they could open up and share whatever they want and feel free without me or him or her worrying about, you know, the impact from the parents.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm really glad that you brought this into the conversation. What ultimately may be the best path forward, you know, feels precarious, but it may be that you are doing way more than you think you are by being that trusted adult in a student's life and saying, hey, let me get you connected to also the school social worker, who is another trusted adult, even for you to talk with her him or her privately, to continue to get support, maybe at some point looking at a therapy referral, you know, if that would be helpful to the youth, or maybe youth mom to kind of connect. So you are still the trusted adult, and that may not feel like you're doing enough, but that actually could have a huge impact, just knowing that the student can come to you and not hide the truth of who they are.
Right.
And then try to see if you can get the youth connected, you know, building resources, building a sense of community, and allies is really important early on in this process of exploring gender or sexuality or coming out. It's helpful to build as much resources as possible, so that there are people to lean on if you are coming out to someone who isn't supportive. Sadly, I've worked with plenty of teens who decide to not come out to a parent until they move out because they just know that it's not going to go well. And so that difficult role for us as the people who know is like, I know this about you. I just want you to be able to freely live your life. But I also recognize that this is probably the best possible option right now, so that you do have secure housing, so that you are able to go to school, so that you have your needs met. So sometimes like the best option doesn't feel great, but it's kind of like the best that's available given the circumstances. So I don't know if that helped. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer. All right, any other questions?
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question along a similar thing. So I'm a counselor at our middle school, and one of the teachers is on here, Julie, and we are looking to start a GSA club at our school.
Awesome.
And so we want to do that. We're trying to get it started during the school day, but we were wondering if you have recommendations around like what the requirements are on parental permission. We were told by our principal she wants us to have permission from the parents, but obviously if they have not come out to parents, we might not be able to necessarily get permission. So I'm not sure if you've had experience with that you could maybe give some direction on that.
Yeah, I don't have specific experience on that. What I can point you to is Q+, which is an organization that works with a lot of LGBTQ youth and specifically does a lot of work with GSAs. So I'm going to point you in their direction to reach out to Mel Cordner is the founder of Q+. I would definitely reach out to them to get that guidance, so that you can do this the right way and kind of honor and respect kids' identities, and to be able to get that done. Let me see real quick if I could pull up their website to help you out. Q+, so it's the letter Q plus.
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there any way you can give AFT a list of some of these resources that you have knowledge of that we can get an email from AFT of the ones that you recommend if we do need help in this area?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Great,
I
thank
can
you.
create that. Yep. And there's Q+'s website for you. If that's helpful, I would reach out to them and get that direct feedback. So they have a lot of experience in working with GSAs already established, so I think that they would definitely help you out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah. And I will work on a resource list for you all. I'm just making a little note here. Okay, so let's go through the last part of the slides here for today's training. So first and foremost, how we support students is representation. Representation matters a great deal. So we can do that in a number of ways, through handouts, in looking at how things are worded in handouts, homework assignments, any sort of family communication. We've talked before, especially in talking about the video, we've talked about direct verbal communication between staff and teachers. We also want to think about nonverbal communication and being mindful of how things are phrased in documents, right? So instead of using terms like mom and dad, or only showing images of family groupings where there is a mom and dad, using terms like caretakers or grown-ups, or using a diversity of images as applicable to what sort of documents or presentations we're using in our schools. I've seen this already happen in some schools, which I think is great. If there's any sort of administrative documents where you have to fill out information about your child, instead of listing, mom or dad, just kind of having people list whoever is the parent or guardian as being a gender neutral term. And then also having books in the classroom or library that reflect a diversity of identities and family compositions. When students see that either their or their family's experiences are depicted in different ways, or at least accounted for and included in different aspects of their school experience, it truly signals to them that they are welcome and that their identity is acknowledged and valid. So again, just trying to do these things to actively combat this cis and heteronormativity that I talked about earlier. Modeling respect for diversity and challenging gender norms, that's also really important. Respect and kindness can and should start at any stage of an educational setting. So making an effort to use language that models respect and kindness in your classroom settings in any aspect of your school. For example, making statements like, well, really anybody can wear pink, or students can play with whatever toys they like. Toys are for everybody. Clothing is for everybody. In this classroom, we value kindness and respect for each other. Teachers and paraprofessionals, all school staff can really gently and compassionately model respect through some of these statements, and through kind of challenging some statements that students may make about gender stereotypes. So, making these statements such as like anybody can wear pink, or toys are for everybody. And very importantly, the last point here, being a really active ally, taking very seriously any reports that you get from students about harassment, bullying, discrimination that your students share with you. Again, thinking back to some of those statistics from the Glsen School Climate Survey, knowing that over 60% of students experience victimization or bullying, but chose not to report it because they didn't think anything would happen. That's something that we can be a part of changing that statistic when we are responding appropriately to reports that our students are giving us. In terms of helping to create a safe space of diverse identities and expressions, get creative with how we divide the classroom. If we have to divide the classroom for certain activities, don't just divide them amongst boys and girls. We can get creative by dividing students based on what side of the classroom they are on, or by having them count off, or by using birthday month, for example. And there could be any number of ways. These are just a few brief examples. Similarly, we also want to get creative about how we greet our students, how we greet groups of people by using non-gendered language such as learners, friends, hello, fellow humans. Any number of those options are important too. And engaging students in curiosity when they make statements. When we hear them make statements to other students or to us about gender norms, we can kind of compassionately just try to open their thinking up a little bit by asking things like, well, what tells you that? I'm really curious. What tells you, for example, that a man can't have long hair? And just as a little tip, that's a great strategy to use with adults too. When you hear people say things like that, just like, oh, I'm really curious. What makes you say that? And thinking back to that video we watched of the brave 7th grader, continue to work through your own discomfort or lack of learning around the diversity of genders and sexual identities, and being very conscious and intentional about how you are reacting to however that comes up in your educational settings and how you're communicating to your students, right? Keeping in mind what that student was saying is like, I could tell that the teacher reacted to me differently. And one of the things that I will put on the resource list for those of you who may not be aware of it is that it's very important for all of us to be following Connecticut state statutes regarding the rights of transgender students. So, for example, transgender students have the right in the state of Connecticut to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. We should not be forcing them to use the bathroom that aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth, for example. So that's important as well. If you're not already aware of that, I will definitely link to that on the resource list. And specifically in terms of affirming trans students' gender identity, it may not seem like it has much of an impact, but taking steps to allow children to express themselves authentically really does have long-lasting mental health impacts. A 2017 study published shows us that socially transitioned transgender children had levels of self-worth and depression similar to that of their cisgender peers. So when kids are allowed to be called a name that they're more comfortable with, to wear clothing that makes them feel comfortable, when we're taking these steps to affirm their gender, the long-term impact is that they have similar rates of depression than cisgender peers who are not experiencing that bullying and harassment at school. That's really important. We want to be in ongoing contact with parents and guardians about a child's social transition if we know that we are working with a student who is engaged in transition. We want to do what we can to support the parents' wishes and to try to work within the school staff to really help protect that youth and keep them comfortable presenting in their affirmed gender while they're at school. And encouraging, other students to use the name and pronoun that student is telling us that they want to use to identify themselves. So finally, to put this all together, let's put this knowledge to use in talking about Taylor. So Taylor is an imaginary student. I've created this profile just to get us thinking a little bit of how we might start applying some of this knowledge from today's training. So I'll read this and then we'll open this up for discussion for a couple of minutes to just see how we would support Taylor. Taylor's a 7-year-old student in 2nd grade. He's previously been known to school staff as a very bright and happy boy who easily socialized with peers and was a very cooperative student. This year, however, is different. During recess and lunchtime, he often wants to sit with or play with the girls in the class, and he occasionally comes to school with nail polish on. The other boys in the classroom mock Taylor, and you overheard a few of them telling him today to quit acting like a girl. And now that you think of it, you've been seeing him acting more withdrawn and having some behavioral outbursts as the year has progressed. So as his school staff, whatever your capacity is, what concerns do you have about Taylor and how would you address them? So again, you can unmute yourself to share or put something in the chat.
I guess the concern I'm having is that he is beginning to, question or realize his gender identity, and that's not the concern. That's the concern is that maybe he doesn't have anyone to talk to about it, or he may be confused, or he doesn't have support, or something like that would be a concern.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, Carol shares a concern for self-esteem. Okay. Anything else? What would you want to take action on? What would you want to do? Okay, Carrie shares, I think it would be time to do some whole class learning. Yeah, open this up to discussion, especially if we're seeing that other boys in the classroom are mocking Taylor, right? This is a problem. Finding a way to help them understand, right? Addressing the entire classroom of you know, here's some things I saw or heard, and these things are concerning. Valuing and modeling kindness and respect, right? Really doing whatever you can in your capacity to help communicate to Taylor that you see what's happening and that you do not think that this is okay. You know, you don't think it's okay for Taylor to be bullied, to keep having these experiences. Maybe you might want to, depending on your role, maybe you want to reach out to Taylor privately and talk to him or kind of check in. Maybe you want to touch base with parents to see if anything has changed at home, right? We want to be really curious about what's happening and keeping an eye on any number of factors that are contributing to what's going on. So, all right. And we also, you know, as I shared in my example personally, we want to make sure that we're not making the assumption that Taylor is trans because Taylor's friends with girls or wearing nail polish. We, you know, want to just kind of see what Taylor tells us about, you know, if anything, what that means to him rather than making assumptions. So Chelsea shares, agree in one-on-one conversation with Taylor and challenging perhaps other students. What does acting like a girl mean? So thanks, great examples. All right, so we're just about out of time. I know we have a couple minutes in case there's any last questions or comments anybody would like to share. That's all I have for today. If there's any questions or comments, you know, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here, and I hope this was helpful. You're welcome, Gina. Awesome, Chelsea. I'm glad this has been informative. That's the hope. Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. I just want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. Please remember to click the link in the chat box to fill out the quick survey. I'm going to throw it in there again. If you need a certificate of completion, please email Anna Mowry at amowry@aftct.org. I will also include her email in the chat box, and she should be sending out an email tomorrow. I hope you will join us in the future for upcoming professional development opportunities we have going on for our members. Those webinars can be found on the calendar of our website, www.aftct.org. And again, thank you for all that you do, and I hope you have a great evening.